Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I can understand that people might prefer networking to hearing about the European economy in the global context. It sounds rather boring. Maybe what you had heard before about CBAM and steel production in ASEAN countries is closer to your business. But my business is not steel, but more the broader economy and in the global context, as I outlined in my title. So what I wanted to do was to provide you very briefly with a bit of the global context as it impinges on the economy. Also, I think the ongoing war in Ukraine, one shouldn't forget. And then I will talk mostly about the EU economy and what we have come to call the middle tech trap in which the EU is. And maybe that should be of interest to you because although the European economy has a fame of being weak and slow, it's actually for the time being rather strong in all the sectors that use steel. So, but I'll come to that in a couple of minutes. So let me first of all say that the impact of geopolitics on the economy is really often overstated. Even in this case, when we have what many people consider a pivotal election in the US. Let me just say a few words about that. The first point for me is that everybody focuses about Kamala Harris versus Trump, about the two people who might become president. But actually for the economy, I would submit, it's more important what the outcome is on the other, so to speak, two elections which are going on at the same time in the United States, namely for control of the Senate and of Congress. And Congress is of course very important because it's decisive on fiscal policy and also many other issues like regulatory policies. The president himself or herself personally controls mainly, of course, foreign policy, with the big dossiers being, as you know, China and Ukraine. And in the case of Trump, if he likes to play around with tariffs, he can do a lot, but not everything. There are some limits in the US Constitution, which I think would prevent Trump from just saying 60% on China and 10% on everybody. That's discussed among legal experts in the US, but there are some limits. Of course, everybody thinks that a Trump election would be very disruptive for Europe, particularly, of course, for Ukraine and NATO. But his economic part on taxation, especially corporate income tax, and on regulatory measures, famous drill, baby drill, that part he will be able to deliver on only if the Republicans have a majority in Congress. And at present, that is uncertain. I think nobody really knows. And I would also interject that if he authorizes more LNG export terminals, which Biden has not, and there again the president has a certain personal power, that would be, of course, very good for Europe for reasons which I will come back in a minute. And of course, again, I will explain why also for Ukraine. But the overall message I would like to send to you is that Trump remains unpredictable. Many of you might have heard about the Project 2025 from a conservative think tank, 800 pages of what the president should do. I don't think Trump is the guy who takes 800 pages and then walks through them. We have seen it also in the election campaign. He has different ideas every morning, basically. So surprises on all fronts remain possible. And as I said, the bottom line is also that basically all combinations of Trump versus Kamala wins, Congress, right, controlled, or Congress without any control, right, with a few independents playing an outside role. All of this remains possible. On the economy, I would expect not that much of a change, not such a big disruption. For us in Europe, of course, the war dominates because that's existential for Europe, for the European Union. And I think what we have seen now, it's essentially a stalemate on the battlefield. And it must say it reminds me to something in the at least continental European history looms large, the 30 Years' War. Many people probably have heard about vaguely in high school. That was started between the Protestant and Catholic part of the various German states that existed then, with the German emperor being on the Catholic side, Habsburg, and trying to root out the Protestants. Whenever he got close to doing that, other powers intervened. Catholic French saved the Protestants. Sweden intervened at the time. And when the Protestants seemed to be winning, then somehow the outsiders changed side and supported the losing part. And that's what kept the war going for so long. And it was really devastating for something which wasn't called Germany then, but the German area of Europe. And unfortunately, I think this is something close to what we are witnessing now, meaning a very long war in which we on the West reinforce our support for Ukraine when the Russians advance. And when the Ukrainians advance, say, okay, now it's good. We don't have to do anything anymore. And so that is unfortunately the likely future. An outright defeat of Russia at this point is very unlikely. But, and I will come back to that, I think the key determinant will in the end be the oil price. My bet would be that the war will end when the oil price goes below $50 a barrel. And I will support that with some look at the Soviet and Russian history. And if you take this is a chart of the oil price in real terms. So not just the nominal, but what it can actually buy. And what you see is that the 1960s were a period of long decline, and then it shot up, Yom Kippur, the first war, 7 Days War, the Yom Kippur War, and then when it reached the second peak, that's when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Why? It's very simple. They were and are still a big exporter of oil and gas, but the two prices are linked in the long run. And therefore, they felt strong, right? In the famous saying, they had bread, guns, and butter, right? They thought they could pay for both. Little did they know that just when they invaded, the tide turned, and then the oil price went basically back to 1/3 of its former level. And you had then the late 1980s and early 1990s period with an oil price going up and down at the bottom. At the first bottom, they left Afghanistan, Soviet Union disintegrate, they accept German unification, they accept NATO expansion, and everything looks nice until about 2000. By the way, Putin was extraordinarily lucky. He didn't know that, because when he came to power, it was at the near bottom of the oil price. And for the first 10 years, he was very popular also because the oil price just kept on increasing, more than doubling. And that provided him with the wherewithal to strengthen Russia. At the first peak in 2008, invasion of Georgia. Then at the second peak, 2014, Crimea, invasion of Donbass. And then there's a sudden drop in the oil price just a few months later, 2015, and that's when Russia agreed to basically not to march forward and take all of Ukraine. Right? And then, okay, we have another peak in 2022. and that's when they invaded. So I think that's the history. It's not just coincidence. It's because the oil price gives Russia, or former and earlier the Soviet Union, the means to become adventurous abroad. As I said, the war is likely to go on for quite some time, but its impact on the economy has been temporary, with one exception. First of all, it's very clear, I think I already said that last time, neither Ukraine nor Russia actually count in economic terms, in global terms. Right? You all know that the economy of Russia is about that of Italy or France at most. But of course, initially there was a strong impact on energy prices, both oil, very short term, and then gas. I don't think I have to tell anybody here about the crazy gas prices we had for short periods of time. But now gas prices have normalized, and they remain, however, and that's the big lingering part, they remain higher than they were before the war. I have given you here 3 lines. The blue and orange line go up and down, and that's the LNG price in Europe, blue, and orange in Asia. And I always emphasize that because the price of gas is linked between Europe and Asia. Somebody talked about ASEAN and steel production and the CBAM there. The price of gas is the same, presumably of coal also, because it's transported by a ship. But, and that's the big point, the price of gas in the US is much, much lower. Why can it remain so much lower? A third, a fourth of the European price. And that's basically because there's insufficient export capacity from the US. Biden has not allowed more export terminals to be built and go into operation. And as I said earlier, the one big change from Trump could be that he says the environmental problems with gas export terminals are not so important. Let's allow more of them. Of course, that would mean that in the US, the gas price would increase a bit, and everywhere else in the world, including Europe, it would fall. Right? Why is that important? This is important for European industry on 2 accounts. First of all, gas is, of course, a feedstock in many productions, especially fertilizers, which has collapsed in Europe. So we now import not more natural gas from the United States, but fertilizer. Right? And fertilizer is basically 90% gas. The second important point is that in Europe, gas is priced at the marginal cost. And the marginal cost at most of the time are not renewables, which cost 0, most of the time. It's natural gas, so-called gas peakers. And therefore, they determine, on average, the gas price, which has, the electricity price, which has remained much higher in Europe. And that's why energy-intensive industries in Europe, whether they use gas directly or whether they use electricity, had to cut back. You can imagine what that means also for steel production using arc furnaces, also the treatment of steel and so on. We have not had the industrial recession, which many people predicted, because what happened was that the energy-intensive industries cut back, and then as one would expect in a flexible economy, the non-energy intensive industries expanded. Right? But this is, I think, important to keep in mind. Going forward, Europe has, at least for some time, as long as the difference in natural gas price remains, a handicap both direct gas and indirectly via electricity. And that is actually also a part of this story about whether Europe can actually, the European economy can survive You have perhaps seen the report by Mario Draghi recently. He said this is do or die moment. If you don't do all of what I've said, there will be slow agony in Europe. And one of the main planks of his plan was to reduce the price of energy in Europe. By the way, Russia doesn't appear here, as I said earlier, because it's not an economic power. But I would also submit to you that this picture here of competition among the three areas is misleading. I will come back to that later. Right? But let me first perhaps take a look at the European economy. As I said earlier, Draghi said this is do or die. We are falling back big time, and something has to be done. And I wanted to put some question mark behind that, and a question mark which explains, I think, to you why perhaps very little is likely to be done. And if you look at the record of the EU economy relative to the US, there are two ways you can look at it. One is which I call the European way of life, which is saying how well do average Europeans live compared to the United States. So there you compare incomes not in dollar terms, but in terms of what you can actually buy. It's called purchasing power parity. And contrary to all the usual narrative, if you look at the orange line here, you see that trend-wise over time, the US has actually improved, the EU has improved relative to the US. In terms of, say, the European way of life, right? In terms of how well people live. Partially this is due to the new member countries like Poland, Romania, and others that have done very well. But I would submit to you that it's a similar picture if you take the old EU countries. So that's when you want to see how well people live. But if you want to see how Europe has fared in terms of its weight in the global economy, then you take just the raw GDP. How much dollars do we produce? And there you see that, of course, it depends a lot on the exchange rate. But you see that since about 2008-9, the weight of Europe has gone down a lot. And that's what people mean when they say, oh, Europe is becoming irrelevant. There's no agony in the sense that actually people live pretty well. And that's why I think it is so difficult for the average European to say, we have to reform. Otherwise, the economy goes to hell. They look around and say, okay, it's not perfect, but right? Why should we change everything? Because the Brussels policymakers, of course, look at the blue line and they want to be strong. They want to be heard in the world. And I actually agree with them. It's important these days when we have Russia out there. But that's the dichotomy which you have. And that's, I think, why it is unlikely that Draghi's alarmistic call for action will fall on very fruitful ground in the member states. Brussels is a different case. I hesitate, but I make a very quick parenthesis on Japan. If I were to show you the blue line for Japan, it would be going down all the time. Right? Japanese GDP in dollar terms has halved over the last 20 years. The orange line for Japan wouldn't look too bad. So the question is whether we in Europe will face a Japanese future. Living pretty well, but sliding into irrelevance. That's the question, right? I don't want to give you my scenario, but I think that's and I will come back to why that might be. If you now take actually manufacturing, so industry output, then I have given you here the data from the World Bank, which is the value added of manufacturing at current exchange rate. So no PPP here, just how much we produce and how much it's worth. You see the rocket coming up there, the line of China, we know everything. It's quite extraordinary, actually, about 20 years times 10. And then you see the red line and the green line, EU and US, more or less the same over the longer period. So in terms of manufacturing, in terms of industry, China has, of course, gone up and dominates the world. But the EU is not deindustrializing, right? It's not behind in overall industry with respect to the United States. And that's another reason why you don't see in industry, I think, this alarmism about the prospects of Europe. Okay, I don't talk about Chinese steel production, which I think we have seen beforehand. Sorry, let me just come back here. Anyway, so you saw the dwarfs down there. That is the UK, the EU, the US, and Japan, which are basically flat, and then China going up. But I think you are in this business, you know that better than I do. But again, in producing goods, Europe is doing pretty well. Its share of global export markets in blue, and here talking about manufacturing exports only, not all, actually has been almost stable, while that of China has gone up, the US has gone down, and actually I don't show it, Japan has also gone down. So actually Europe isn't doing that badly in manufacturing again. So come back to this trilateral comparison. Europe is actually not doing too badly in how well people live, what kind of living standards it provides, but at current exchange rates and some other areas, it's way behind. In manufacturing, China stands out, of course, but basically Europe doesn't do too badly. And I would say it doesn't do too badly basically in all the sectors that use steel, right? Manufacturing, automotive, machinery. So I think you all here have still a good market in front of you, despite all this talk about European decline. But of course, there's one area where Europe is behind, and that was also highlighted by Draghi, namely in terms of innovation. Now, why is Europe behind in terms of innovation? First question is, what do the governments do? And actually what you find is that public support to innovation in the EU, by member states and the EU level, is very similar to that of the US. Around 0.7% of GDP. So not insignificant, but as I said, more or less the same. The big difference is in private business investment. Private R&D investment. And that is almost 1/2 in the EU of the US. Right, so that is, I think, the key issue. Our enterprises spend much less on R&D, on research and development. Why? Is it just because they spend less? Ceteris paribus in the US? No, the key reason is the sectors in which our industry is in. European industry is focused on middle tech sectors where research and development is much less important. And of course, we know that the high-tech sector grows much more quickly. So over time, the distance to the US increases. So let me show you first. This is the overall R&D spending, which are basically boring flat lines. Nothing much has changed. So you can ask, why all the excitement now? The key is the sectoral composition of R&D spending. Maybe you can concentrate on the left two bars. One is the EU, and the other one is the US. And you see the US in total is 3 times higher. US economy is bigger, and the share of GDP going to R&D, so it's almost 3 times more than in the EU. So the resources devoted overall to research and development are much higher in the US. But then if you look at the colors, that is where the real difference is. Let me ignore the greenish ones, which are the other industries, which are very low tech, so less R&D spending. If you look at the reddish ones, that is basically automotive and other mid-tech sectors. You see that actually the red, portion is higher in the EU than the US. So European automotive sector spends more in R&D than the US. And still didn't get a Tesla, right? So they spend a lot on incremental innovation in this sector, which is mature, and unfortunately also mature enough to be taken on by China. But then if you look at the bluish part, which is the high-tech sector, there you see the big difference. There the US spends five times that much. And if you look at the top element of the blue bar, that's software. That's almost absent in the in the EU. So that is the really big difference between the EU and the US, and that is where the innovation gap is. It is in this composition of investment. And if you allow me, I just will insist on that. What I showed you earlier was 2022. But here we have a table where we look at the 3 biggest enterprises spending on R&D in each region: US, EU, and Japan. 2000, 2012, 2022. So let me compare 2003, sorry. Let me compare 2003 and 2022. In the US, we start with Ford, Pfizer, and GM, auto and pharma. We end up with software. Total change industrial structure. Let's take the EU. Mercedes, Siemens, VW, auto. Right? We come to the end, VW, Mercedes, Bosch, auto. The same industries throughout. And that's why we call it the middle tech trap. Japan, if you want, does even worse because Taiwan is auto and then consumer electronics. And the Japanese consumer electronics was basically killed by the smartphone. And at the end, we are in Japan, auto and telecom, which is not a very high R&D intensive sector. And I think that is the key issue for Europe. It's not so much how much we spend, but where we spend it. Namely, in these sectors, which are middle tech. It's not that there is no advancement in these sectors, but just it is much slower than the software and the high-tech sectors that the Americans dominate. Let me not go too much in this. On software here I give you the distribution of the global total of software spending. Already in 2003, the Americans accounted for 72%, and the Europeans for 7%. 20 years later, the Americans have actually increased somewhat their dominance, and the Europeans are at the end, as usual. Right? So I think that is the key problem for Europe, not in the manufacturing sector that I showed earlier. And one of the reasons for that is that actually, if you look at the profit margins, you see that the red sector, mid-tech, has more or less similar profit margins all over, except Japan. Japan firms apparently don't make any profits in any sector. But if you look at the blue, that's where the Americans excel. That's NVIDIA with 80% or 60% profit margin, Microsoft 50%, and Mercedes, when it's lucky, gets 8 to 9%. So that's the difference. Plus, of course, the growth rate. The high-tech sectors grow 20% every year. The car sector is now more or less mature. What is different, or what is similar across both sides of the Atlantic, is actually how much capital expenditure there is. European enterprises, this is now capital, not investment in research and development, but hardware, right? Structures, machines, and other things. Lots of things made of metal or requiring steel. And there you see that the European enterprises actually spend a lot in the other sectors which are not R&D incentive, the green ones, and they spend very little even on computers or computer centers, the blue part. So it's not the magnitude, but the composition. Why am I emphasizing that? Because for those who have read the Dari report, at the end he says suddenly, and by the way, we need 800 billion more in investment in Europe. 800 billion additional investment, 4% of GDP. And my answer would be, we don't need 800 billion additional. We need to change the composition of our expenditure and give our industry a different direction. Now, why did we call it a trap? There's basically, as I said earlier, some path dependency. The European firms invest in the sectors they know best, incremental innovation. The bank-based financial system that we have in Europe finances hard stuff, right, which they can take as a security. And going into new sectors means a high risk of failure, and the cost of failure in Europe is very high. Redundancy payments are 3 times as high as in the US. So all these are reasons why there is little appetite by European enterprises themselves to go into new sectors. The few sectors, firms we have actually in the chip sector, for example, were all spin-offs from large industrial conglomerates, which said it's too risky. And they spun it off, and in some cases, the spin-off now is worth much more than the parent company beforehand. Right? So that is, I think, the landscape, and that's the problem in Europe. And now let me come to perhaps one part at the end, which might be a bit more controversial, which is that in all this, let's say, story about European, whatever, non-presence in high-tech, but strength in manufacturing, comes, of course, the question, what about the trade wars? Will they have a negative impact on Europe? And here, I wanted to give you one reason let me just give you one reason why actually the US-China trade war is good for Europe, and why Trump, in that sense, might be good for Europe. Here I've given you, just as an example, the market for electric vehicles. You have China with lots of factories, would like to export to the United States, but they are blocked. So what happens? These go to Europe, and Europe instead exports much more to the United States. So with the Trump tariffs, you have a big US market, which has basically been protected from Chinese competition for the Europeans. So if the Europeans cannot compete with the Chinese in many sectors, in Europe, as long as Europe doesn't erect barriers, in the US they can. So what you should expect over time is that European exports to the US will be doing well. We'll have more exports into the EU. Our politician will scream, oh, a flood of Chinese exports, it ruins our industry. But actually, our exports to the US more than make up for the imports from China. But politicians don't see that, of course. So that's the tension that will come. But in case if you are looking for an export market where you don't have to fear the Chinese, I think you go to the US. So, and I think that ties in with the global pattern of global comparative advantage, which I would like to conclude upon. Basically, the US is specializing, as I have shown earlier, in high tech, and at the same time in commodities, shale oil, gas, wheat, soya. And of course, the manufacturing sector in the US gets squeezed. China is of course doing everything, but particularly strong in capital-intensive industries and industries where you have economies of scale. PV panels, they can do 1 billion of them in big factories at a very low margin, and there I think nobody can compete. But the machines, the best machines to produce the most advanced chips, they're done in Europe. They produce, the famous Dutch company ASML, produces perhaps a dozen of them per year, 20, 30, but not hundreds of thousands. And that's an area where the Chinese can compete much less. And I think that's the area where Europe still can hold it on its own, and it's not squeezed by China. And I think the key of condition, of course, is that we find our industry goes more into these niches, so gets out of the middle tech that I mentioned earlier, and gets an incentive to go more in the high-tech sectors, which initially will appear risky, but are they the only ones who provide, say, growth opportunities and also profits over time. So Europe has a glorious past. Europeans live well, but the question mark is whether, in Europe at least, we can make the transition to the new economy, which is much less manufacturing industry-based, and which requires also new structures, new ways to organize our labor and capital, our financial markets. But that's our challenge, not so much China or the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Any questions from the floor for Daniel? Luis, can we have the microphone? Where is the lady?
If you want to come up here and...
Just a second, we'll bring the microphone right away. Sorry about that.
Thank you. You mentioned the top three areas that people spent R&D budget on in 2003, 2012, 2022. But you didn't have China on that list. What would they have if you were to, that one, forward two more? That one, that's it. Where's China on that list?
2003, you wouldn't have anybody, right? You're quite right, I didn't put it there. China would be mostly middle tech, still. Middle tech, still 2022, right? Because the Chinese companies are just so big in this sector. And I'm saying plural because in the automotive sector, for example, there are so many of them, but the biggest companies would still in middle tech, with of course one or two which came up a lot in the software sector, but which then the government put down again.
Thank you. Rami?
So thanks for the presentation. For the slide for the manufacturing for exports, we have seen that the US was not growing manufacturing for exports. Is that because of they are shifting, or maybe if we have another view on the total manufacturing? So not only for exports, they are also growing.
The simple answer is they don't need to. In the sense that we in Europe import, let's say, 3 to 4% of our GDP, hundreds of billions in oil and gas. The Americans don't import them, right? They have a surplus. So we need to export our cars, our machineries, to pay for the oil we're importing. The Americans, in 2000, a little bit they needed to. In 2022, they no longer need to, and therefore the manufacturing industry has been squeezed. And on top of that, you have also wheat and soya and so on. It's not that the government does it, it's just that the economic pressure from the other sectors is so strong that the manufacturing in between.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? May I have one last question? I know that China may not be your real expertise, but any thoughts on how Chinese government can topple their current economical problems, the current crisis in the country?
They won't.
That was not the answer I was expecting.
They will, of course, pretend. They can't, and it's not in their interest. Okay? Let me start with the can't. The Chinese, this rocket I showed, industrial production, that was based on an extraordinary accumulation of capital. High-speed trains, roads, airports, everything, factories, right? Everything. And it's extraordinary. Nobody has done that in 20 years. And that was possible because the Chinese economy, not the households, but the Chinese economy, saves about 40% of its national income. For comparison, in Europe it's around 20. Turkey a bit more, US a bit less. Right? If you save 40% of your income, you can build everything very quickly. Now you have built everything. What do you do next? Right? But people continue to save. Right? The Chinese have now 42 square meters per capita of new apartments. But the building activity continues. So they can build another 42 square meters in another 10 years, but right? Then some houses might be empty. And that's their problem. The additional investment becomes less and less productive. It was extremely productive. I could show you a chart. The productivity of investment, physical investment, China goes down and down and down, right? It's still slightly positive, but it will continue going down. Japan had the same problem in the 1990s. So they should increase consumption. But the current government has actually said, we are not interested in increasing consumption. That's consumerism. That's Western style. We are Confucians. We are sober, right? Away with all these Western luxury goods, right? So that's the part they can't. The second part is, if they wanted to have more growth from new enterprises, they would have to reduce the control on the economy. Alibaba, Tencent, right? But these guys speak out. They speak out because they are people who disrupt, to have new ideas, right? So they won't, it's not in their interest, because they don't want to have a flourishing sector with innovation that's not under the control of the party. So that's why the Chinese economy will not crash, but it will rather have a slow decline, with the government every year coming out with new ways to boost growth, but the pattern will remain the same.
Thank you. So if we don't have any other questions, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Daniel.